Hello everyone, Neil here. Welcome back. We pick up where we left off with the last video, which you remember. We were creating the templates for the value scale color wheel and for the pigment file. We're going to pick up where we left off and actually start to lay out the colors that we're going to need for our 20 space color wheel, right? There are 20 hues based on the Munsell color system. The 20 hues are categorized into 3 orders. The primary, secondary, and tertiary orders. So if you remember, the Munsell color system is based on 5 primaries: red, yellow, purple, blue, and green, 5 secondaries, and 10 tertiaries. So we've got 20 spaces, and with the value scale color wheel, which is what we're going to focus on in the short term, we'll get to the pigment file after the value scale color wheel is finished. The value scale color wheel takes those 20 hues and breaks them down into strings, or degrees of light or dark, values of each hue. So that's what we're going to focus on, at least for right now. As I said, we'll get to the pigment file later. It's 11:30 in the morning here. I have my second cup of coffee right in front of me. So I'm ready to go until this thing is done. As I mentioned in the last video, I am going to break these down into smaller chunks though, maybe 25 to 30 minute chunks, so that you don't have to listen to me drone on for 2 or 3 hours as I'm constructing this. You can watch each chunk bit by bit and follow along for each part of the wheel that I'm constructing. So with that said, let's move to the tabletop. Just give me a second. I'm going to set my timer for 30 minutes and we're off. Okay, so again, reminder from the discussion with the last video. This is what we're going for. Now, this is a computer printout, and I've painted on that, so a reminder, the one I'm going to be creating on my canvas here, my piece of canvas, my 14 by 14 inch canvas, is not going to look as neat and clean, but it's going to have all the important information, and that's really what we're going for here, is to at least give you a color wheel that has all the important information for your painting process. And I'm also going to leave the color wheel up in the corner, I always got to remember, there, in the corner, so that you can see where all this is going as we mix. So again, to remind you, I already mentioned it, but repetition is the mother of skill. We're dealing with 20 hues on this color wheel. Primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. The primary colors have 1 letter. Secondary colors have 2 letters. Tertiary colors have 3 letters. So 3 orders of colors. Let's move this off. So we need to get into then the colors that you're going to need to create the color wheel. As I go through this, if you're looking at what I'm laying out and thinking, you know what, I don't have the money for all these colors, then I believe I mentioned in the last video, if you don't have the money to lay out a 20 space color wheel, a 20 hue color wheel, then at least I'm going to show you how to do the whole thing. But if that's a little too expensive right now, then just lay out a color wheel using the primary and secondary colors. That's it. So I would suggest lay the template out or create the template the same way I showed you, but only purchase the primary and secondary families. That's it. That's at least a good place to start, and you can always add the tertiary colors as you go. Now, as far as pigments, I recommend with my students in my classes, I recommend almost all Gamblin pigments. And it's not because Gamblin is perfect or they're the best paint available. They are cost effective and accessible. Now, there are a few hues that I will specifically say you need from a particular manufacturer, and that's because the manufacturer makes a particular tube that falls exactly where I want it to fall on this color wheel. You know, any of you that have used, any type of, or gone to different brands before, you'll recognize that, you could see Gamblin, Winsor&Newton, Old Holland, and all 3 of them might say Cadmium Yellow Medium, but all 3 might look slightly different in terms of the hue. One might have a little bit more of an orange bias, one might have more of a yellow bias. So there are slight differences between brands. As I said, I recommend Gamblin just because they're easy to find and they're relatively inexpensive. So the colors, the pigments that I'm going to be laying out in front of you, don't be confused if you see other brands that aren't Gamblin. You can stick with Gamblin, mostly Gamblin. There are a few Winsor&Newton that I'm going to recommend. But again, the reality is, if you already have a box of pigments, just use what you have. Again, I stress what I mentioned in the video before this. What we're trying to do here, it's not we're creating some magic tool. We're trying to create a tool that helps you organize your paint box. So if you have an existing box of paint and you have a different brand of Cadmium Yellow Light than me, then just stick with it. You can certainly, go with Gamblin or some of the other colors that I might recommend. But the important thing is, if you don't have the money, stick with what you have if you already have a particular brand of one of the colors that I recommend, and just go with it. So let's start with titanium white and ivory black. Now, you'll notice I'm not talking about the neutral black that we talked about from the first video on making a value scale. The neutral black is a combination of ivory black and raw umber. You just need ivory black. We're going to be adding that into some of the color families to darken them without the neutral. So white, ivory black, at yellow, cadmium yellow light, yellow red, either cadmium yellow or, depending on the brand, it might be cadmium yellow medium, yellow red, cadmium orange, yellow red, cadmium red light, red, cadmium red medium, red purple, alizarin crimson, red purple, quinacridone magenta. Move this over just a little bit. There we go. Purple, dioxizine purple. Now, the reason I skipped families, purple, red, purple, is because I don't have a tube for that. I could buy one, but I don't think I need one. A lot of these colors, what I should have mentioned is, I'm not going to have you buy 20 tubes of paint. A lot of the colors, a lot of these hues, I should say, are going to be what is called bracketed. And bracketed means we don't have an existing tube, so we're going to grab the two closest tubes or hues that are available and mix between them to make that hue. Now, certainly I could buy a purple, red, purple, but I'm always trying to look for ways to keep the expenses down in the studio. So what we're going to do then eventually, as you'll see, is we're going to bracket, which means mix these two tubes, which is the closest available, mix them together to get this purple, red, purple. So purple, we have dioxazine purple. Purple blue, again, we're going to skip families because we're going to bracket for the purple, blue. So purple blue is ultramarine blue. We're going to skip families again. Blue is phthalo turquoise. Now, this will be one that I definitely recommend getting from Winsor&Newton. That's specifically from Winsor&Newton. Because I know Gamblin's phthalo turquoise has a definite and visibly green bias to it. The phthalo turquoise has kind of a cyan quality to it. So I recommend the Winsor&Newton phthalo turquoise because it falls very nicely at blue without having too much of a green bias. Again, we're going to bracket eventually for blue, purple, blue. So Winsor&Newton phthalo turquoise. Skip families again. Phthalo green. Skip families again. And here again, I'll specify, only because I'm very confident of this manufacturer in this hue, Winsor&Newton Permanent Green Light. There could be other brands that the hue works as well as this particular manufacturer, but I'm not as familiar. So if you can get the Winsor&Newton Permanent Green Light, go for it. And finally, Cadmium Green for our green yellow. So as I said, any of the spaces that are missing, you'll see eventually as we go through, we're going to bracket or mix between the tubes that we have to get those in between. In this case, all of these are tertiary hues. So as I said, looking at this, Price it out. If it's too expensive, then only buy the primary and secondary hues and leave it at that. You can add these in as you go. Also, we'll discuss, particularly when we get over to the greens, that we could actually even eliminate these two tubes, the Permanent Green Light and Cadmium Green, and bracket the entire range of green between Cad Yellow Light and Phthalo Green, but we'll discuss that when we get there. So again, there are always ways to reduce this list if price is a problem. The only other two tubes of paint you're going to need for the construction of the color wheel are raw umber. In fact, I'm going to put this here. No, I'll put it over here for now. Raw umber and burnt umber. That's it for now. Let's see, we've got everything out in front. Okay, that should do it. So I'm going to remove these, and I mentioned with the last video, I will be adding all this information into the description section, so don't get worried if you missed any of the information as we went. So I'm back. Sorry for the transition. I had to take just a little bit of a break to collect some materials that I thought I had sitting right next to me, but did not. So I got rid of the paint, right? We went over the paints that are necessary for the exercise. Now we get to just some of the materials you have to have handy for our mixing so that we can get into mixing the first family, which will be yellow, and then applying it to our value scale color wheel. So things that you will need: palette, right? I've got my handy dandy glass palette here, palette knife, paint scraper, my value scale, right, which you should have. And if you remember at the end of the lesson on making a value scale, I mentioned the last thing that I typically do with a value scale is take some of the Neo McGilp or whatever else I use to put it down. Might have been Liquin or Galkid, but Neo McGilp doesn't yellow a lot, so it's actually, I prefer it. Taking a little bit after the value scale is dry and coating the entire value scale with, in this case, some of the Neo McGilp. The reason is it creates a little bit of a varnish over it, brings all the colors up or the values up to where they looked like, to where they looked when they were wet. Some of you have seen that darker values of paint sometimes do what's called sinking in, which they get matte and look lighter than they actually do when they're wet. So the final coat with, in this case, with Neo McGilp, not only does it bring all those values up to where they look, or to how they look when they're wet, but it also creates that little bit of a barrier so that as we go, pardon me, as you'll see, I'm going to be putting paint that I'm mixing directly on my value scale to help me check the values of the colors that I'm mixing. So we have our value scale available with that coat of Neo McGilp that is dry, and a few brushes that will help us apply the paint. So move some of this off. The other thing, off camera, I have plenty of paper towels and a container of Gamsol so I can clean my brush when necessary as we go. Put these over here. So the only thing we're going to need right now then in front of us at this moment, keep the paint scraper available. What I often tell my students, again, as they're starting this until they get used to mixing, take a Sharpie marker and go ahead and make some indications of the values across your value scale. It'll help you when you're putting your paint out to figure out where things go and to help you understand how many values you need to mix of each string. So if you remember, the Munsell value scale, which is what we're using, has 11 total values. 10 is white, 0 is black, and there are 9 grays in between. The reason I'm only going from 9 to 1, no color ever falls at white and no color ever falls at black. Those are the extremes. The entire color world and all our colors fit somewhere in between. So we only need from 9 to 1. Keep the value scale handy. So the first family we're going to start with is yellow. And the 2 tubes of paint you're going to need to mix a string of yellow is Cadmium Yellow Light and raw umber. And the reason you need the raw umber is, if you didn't know, it is basically a darker, weaker chroma yellow, right? If we think about the dimensions of color, hue, value, and chroma, yeah, everyone says this is brown, but let's be more specific. Let's designate or understand the hue of raw umber. The hue of raw umber is yellow. It is a darker, weaker chroma yellow. So to mix a string, remember a string is a series of values of a particular hue, we need the raw umber to help us darken the cadmium yellow light. We're not going to just add a neutral black. Thankfully in our paint box we have a darker, weaker chroma yellow that will help us darken this cadmium yellow light. So some terms we have to go over as we get into this. Home value. Home value is very important. The definition of a home value, it is the value at which the color comes right out of the tube. The home value of cadmium yellow light is a 9. And how did I determine that? I squeezed it out, put it on various spots of the value scale, and the closest value that it came to was a 9. Now it gives me a good opportunity here to mention, when paint manufacturers are making paint, they are not making paint to be Munsell value specific. What does that mean? That means when Gamblin made this cadmium yellow light, they had their dry pigment, they added the safflower, linseed oil, whatever they added to this to make the paint, to make the oil, to make cadmium yellow light. They were not making this specifically to be a 9, 8, or 7 value. The job when we're putting this value scale or this value scale color wheel together is, whatever paint you have, you've got to figure out where these tubes fall in our scale of values. So the reason I bring this up, because manufacturers are not making their paint to be exactly value specific, there are times when when you mix out an entire string, you might see some areas bunch up a little bit, primarily due to the fact that the tube paint might be plus or minus a particular hole step. In this case, cadmium yellow light is not an exact 9, but it's also not an exact 8. I've got to make a best guess which value right out of the tube I think it works better at. And in this case, I think it works better at a 9. So the home value is the value at which the paint comes right out of the tube, where it falls on our scale of values. So the home value of cadmium yellow light is a 9. The home value of raw umber is a 2. And that's the reason why I like to start with yellow, because we have, just with these two tubes of paint, a home value that's at this one end of the scale, a home value that's all the way almost down at the other end of the scale. So the only thing I need to do to mix a string of yellow is mix between these two tubes to make my string. So we're going to take our Cad Yellow Light, check my time, and squeeze it out at a 9, which is its home value. Give yourself plenty of paint. Put this aside for now. I'm going to take my raw umber, which is my shade, which means it's the darkening agent I'm going to use for my yellow. I'm going to put it out at a 2. All I need to do to make my string of yellow is mix in between. So take some of my Cad Yellow Light, move it to the 8. Actually, I can move it down here. I've got plenty of mixing space. Take a little bit of my raw umber. Now you notice, I reiterate what I mentioned in the value scale lecture. Do not scoop. Do not scoop your paint. You notice how I drew the raw umber off the corner. It gives me a much more controlled draw of paint. So I'm just trying to drop this a little bit, right, from a 9 to an 8. Mix a little bit in. Now, the nice thing about having the value scale available, if you remember, when we mixed up the initial value scale, we had nothing. We had white, we had our neutral black, we had to mix in between, and then using that method of isolating the values in threes to help us tune the values to make sure that there were even steps in between. Well, now that I have my value scale created, now instead of having to just mix this string and then tune it the same way, because I have the value scale available, I can tune each pile as I go. So I took a little bit of the raw umber, added it in. Now the difficult thing here, as you're going to see, and it's going to take some of you, maybe all of you have done this for the first time, it's going to take you a little bit of time to get used to, is relating a very chromatic value or a very chromatic pile of paint to a gray value. It's going to take a little bit of doing, and how we do that is, I'm going to add just a little bit more paint. One method is to get some of the value at hand on your palette knife and hold it up in front of the value that you're trying to match. When you squint, now I know it's going to be hard to see because of the shadow that's cast, what you're doing then, holding it up in front of that value, is squinting to see if the edges of the color of this yellow melt into the gray. The easiest way to kind of be able to see what I'm talking about, if you can't quite tell by holding it up in front of the value that you're trying to match, move it to the darker value next to it and move it to the lighter value next to it. The idea being that if I'm trying to mix an 8, and I'm not exactly sure whether I have an 8 or not, if I move this to the right to the darker value of 7, if it is clearly lighter than the 7, and then I move it over to the 9, and it is clearly darker than the 9, so it's lighter than this value and darker than this value, then I know I've got to be in the range, right? Because it's going to be very difficult, even for someone who's done it. I can't unsee that chroma. I can't just tune that out. But what I can do is look for this color to melt, the value to melt. It's called passage. It's where the value at the edge of the paint knife looks like it just bleeds into the gray. As I said, a good way to check to see if you're in the right range, if you're not quite getting what I'm saying, if you can't see it, move it to the darker value. It should be lighter than that. Move it to the lighter value, it should be darker than that. So the other way to do it, besides holding your paint knife in front of it, again, because we have the Neo McGilp that is dry, take some of what's on your palette knife and put it directly on your value scale. Might be easier to see in light of all these competing lights. So when I look at these three, I've put one on the value that I'm looking for, looking to mix. I put one on the lighter value to the left, and I put one on the darker value to the right. So when I squint, what I should see is the patch here bleeds in, right? If I look at this one, it should be lighter. If I look at this one, it should be darker. If I look at this one, it should look like it bleeds in. Right now, it looks like when I squint, and again, I don't know what exactly if it's easy to see from the camera. When I squint, the pile here, this patch looks just a little bit lighter than the gray behind it. This is certainly, I'm bordering on darker than the 9, but it still looks just a little bit lighter than the gray. So I will add just a touch more of the raw umber. As I said, it's going to take some time to get used to this tuning process. But repetition is the mother of skill. You keep doing it, it's going to get easier and easier. Not to mention, the more you mix these strings, the more you build a visual memory of what these things actually look like, what these hues look like at different values. Do the same thing. Put it on each side. That's what I was looking for. So when I do this, I added just a little bit more of the raw umber. Now this is definitely, when I put it on the 9, it's definitely darker than the 9. It's still clearly lighter than the 7. When I squint, that patch looks like it bleeds in to that 8 just a little bit better than it did before. So, and of course I'd keep tuning until I got the proper value. Again, I can understand just even looking at what I'm seeing on my screen, it doesn't look like there's a visible jump between these two, but there is. So move down to my 7. Again, take a little bit of the Cad Yellow Light, add a little bit more. And do the same thing. See, it's a little bit darker than the 8. Put it on the 7. Put some on the 8. Put some on the 6. It's definitely a little bit darker than the 8. It's definitely lighter than the 6, but when I squint, I can still really see this patch popping out of the 7. I don't have that passage or the bleed of the edges. And again, squint. The key here is to keep squinting. Every good painter should have crow's feet. Don't be ashamed of them. It's a sign that you're squinting, that you're doing what you need to do to relate your, in this case, values. Still definitely lighter than a 6. Absolutely darker than the 8. So I know I'm in the ballpark. It still looks a little bit too light. When I squint, I could still see this popping. I'll add just a touch more. And I already know I'm in the right range because it's darker than this and lighter than this, so I'm just going to put some right down in here. Very close. Just a touch more. Drawing from the side. That's better. So now, and as I said, if you keep working with this, you're going to see what I'm talking about. When I'm squinting, and I look at this gray patch right around the paint that I just put down, I could still see this yellowish, I could still see there's chroma there, but the edges of that patch bleed into the gray. 7. Need a little bit more Cad Yellow Light. Now, as far as amounts, remember the swatches that you need for the color wheel are not large. I'm making larger piles than I know I'm going to need, just to make sure that you can see what I'm doing here. Mix my 6. And on we go. And this is the checking process. So I mentioned it's good to have the Sharpie out to mark your palette so you don't get confused. You know exactly what values have yet to be mixed and how many. It's a little too close to the, certainly lighter than the 5. I'm looking for a 6. It's lighter than the 5. It's just a hair darker than the 7. I need more raw umber. That's better. Definitely darker than the 7, still lighter than the 5. It's getting very close. Just a little bit more. I think we're going to go over our time just a little bit, but as I mentioned, look at the color wheel. It might seem a little daunting, but once you get the gist of what's going on and how to mix these strings, it's just a matter of taking the time to do it. Right? Get your favorite subscription service on, get a movie, or binge watch whatever your favorite show is while you're mixing. 6, just a touch more. There we go. Perfect. I didn't be bordering on just a touch too dark, but I'm going to go with it. A little bit more. I grab a little bit more, as I certainly know as I go darker I'm going to need more. And as you go, particularly on this string, because the raw umber is darker and weaker, particularly because it's weaker in chroma, the darker this gets, the more it starts to minimize the chroma, that intense chroma from the cadmium yellow light. So it will be easier and easier to see the similarities in value as the chroma reduces. a 4, definitely darker than a 6. You remember from the first lesson, making the value scale, it's always more, let's see, you use less paint, and it's always easier and faster to darken a light. That means I'm not going to start with the raw umber and add the yellow. Under most circumstances, I'm going to start with the yellow and darken with the raw umber. Now, the only exception is when I get down here to a 3, I'll reverse that because I'm close enough to the raw umber that it will make more sense. But all the way down to the 4, I'm still starting with the yellow and adding the raw umber. A little bit darker. Picking it up and putting it down. Definitely lighter than a 3, darker than a 5, but it has to come down just a little bit more. As much as possible, and certainly if you're mixing and really being conscious of what you're doing and checking your values, what you should see as you go, and certainly when you're done, is there should be relatively even steps between these. If you remember the lecture, the discussion when you made the value scale, you don't want these values to bunch up. Now, I mentioned because manufacturers are not making them value specific, home values might bunch up a little bit with their neighbors because some of these home values are actually plus or minus values. Like I said, the cadmium yellow light is not a true 9, it's not a true 8. It's probably a 9 minus or an 8.5, but it has to go somewhere. So you might see some of these areas bunch up when you're right near the home value, but the rest of the values, you want to work to make sure that your spacing is as even as possible. Don't get crazy about it. But you actually want to get to painting. You don't want to spend your entire day mixing a string. But if it's really out of whack, then the whole point of preparing a palette is kind of ridiculous if you're not at least trying to make the spacing between these values consistent. I have my 4, and then finally, as I mentioned, when I get to the 3, I'll reverse my process. I'll start with the raw umber and add a touch of my Cad Yellow Light. Again, this way, reversing it, even in the sense that I'm now taking the dark value and adding the light, but I'm still only drawing from the side of the pile. I don't scoop. Don't want to scoop. Too dark. It has to come up higher. Oh. All right. We're going to go a little over. I think actually we're more than a little over, but it's important to get through this first string so that you at least see the process. I'm going to take you through each one of the families so you know how to mix the formula for every string. That's pretty close. Lighter than that, darker than that. There, good match. We'll put our raw umber back in at the 2. And even just putting this out, I think I can tell this can come down just a hair more in its relation to the raw umber. But of course, understanding that again, because raw umber, that's just a little too dark. The raw umber was not manufactured to be a specific 2 value. There. That's better. There's a little bit of a jump here because the raw umber is actually kind of a 2 minus, but again, it is what it is. So I've at least paid as much attention as I could to making sure that my mixtures match the value scale. I have my Cad Yellow Light, which is my home value, and my raw umber, in this case with yellow, it is my shade or my darkening agent. Just get some of the contamination out here. The only thing I have left to do is to add a little touch of Ivory Black to the raw umber to get my 1. And the reason I'm not worried about the neutral, adding the neutral black, is this is so dark and weak in chroma anyway, that the jump between the 2 and the 1, you're not going to see any effect. Remember we talked initially about the Ivory Black, because it falls in the blue side of the spectrum. If you mix it to yellow, you'll get green. Well, this is so dark and weak in chroma that I'm not going to see that effect anyway. So I'm not going to bother mixing a neutral in there. I'll just add a little bit of my Ivory Black to darken the raw umber to a 1. And I have my full string, just a touch more. So, now that we have the string, one other thing to bring up, another term to add to the list of terms that we've been talking about. So home value is the value at which the tube of paint comes right out of the tube, where it falls on our value scale. Full chroma, there's another term, is the value at which the hue reaches its maximum intensity. And that's the important thing with these strings. And the reason why I didn't randomly grab burnt umber or some other shade to darken the yellow. If I would have taken burnt umber, which we'll find out very shortly as we get to move on to the color wheel, burnt umber is actually a dark orange or yellow red. I could have taken Alizarin Crimson. I could have taken other colors, other dark tubes of paint to darken this yellow, but they wouldn't have kept the hue consistent. If I took burnt umber, which is a darker orange, it would have darkened the yellow. It certainly would have reduced the chroma, but it would have also pulled that yellow, that Cad Yellow Light, into another color family. So what we're trying to do with these various formulas I'm going to go through to create the strings is to make sure that when we create the string, we're getting light and dark values, but the hue is consistent throughout. So we have the raw umber, home value, cadmium yellow light, home value, to make our string, our series of values of yellow. One of the things you notice is the hue is consistent then, based on what I'm saying. The value changes, but the other thing that changes is the chroma changes. The intensity of this string is not the same throughout the whole string. The intensity, or the chroma, is at its highest at the 9 value, right out of the tube. That is the full chroma value. So in the case of yellow, the home value is 9, right? The value that it comes right out of the tube is 9. But also, in this case, the full chroma is 9. Now, you might say, well, isn't that the same with every color family? No, it isn't. And you'll see that when we get there. But keep that in mind. 2 terms. Home value and full chroma. Once we have the string mixed, move our objects. I will make sure, get some Gamsol, give this a good scrub. You want to clean this up before you get to the next color family. Get a little bit of Neil McGilp. And it's going to take a little doing here. I'm actually going to put the palette up here so you won't see it, just because I need some space, and start adding the paint. Actually, I will, just for this first thing I'm going to show you. You remember when we created the template, I mentioned that the outer ring is called the hue circuit. The patch, the swatch of paint that you put on the hue circuit is always the full chroma value. And then we start with the value scale from there. So taking a little bit of my, move this up just a little bit, Neo McGilp, again, not scoop, pull from the side, draw from the corner to make sure I get a controlled amount of medium. The Neo McGilp is going to make this a little creamier, and it's also going to extend the drying time, or I should say shorten the drying time of the paint. Take some of that Cad Yellow Light, get it to a workable, creamy consistency, and put a nice size swatch on the outer ring. And as I said, some of you that want to get with more time on your hands, if you want to get more finicky with this, you can get a circle template and create nice little areas for yourself. I'm just putting a nice size swatch of paint. Now what you're going to start to realize, and of course the one thing that you're going to see as we go around with these various, and you're working with these various tubes of paint, you have differences in opacity and transparency. And it's one of the things you're just going to have to deal with. We all have to deal with. Cadmium Yellow Light right out of the tube is not the most opaque paint. So I can already see some of the gray underneath is showing through. Just do the best you can. I realize what I'm going to have to do is wait for this to dry and give it another coat. So the full chroma value goes on the hue circuit, and then I just start putting my values down from 9 to the inner ring, which is 2. So I still have that 9 on my paintbrush. I put it at on the hue circuit, and now at the 9 value, which is the outermost ring of the 9, put a swatch. Now I'll put this up here. Clean my brush, and I'm just going to work on through, put the rest in. As I said, if the gray is coming through and you're having a hard time with the opacity, you just have to wait for it to dry and put another application on. 8. As I said, it might be hard with the equipment to see that there's a difference between the two, but there is. 7. I'm using a size 2 filbert, which has a wide head, so it allows me to put a good size swatch of paint. 6. Oop. 5. Now what you'll notice as you do this, actually, well, hold on, let me get this down first and then we'll have the conversation. 4. 3. 2, which is our pure raw umber. Again, it's not the most opaque. Actually worked out okay here. And 1. They're going to get a little tight on that inner ring, but so be it. So I have my entire string from, I have my hue circuit, which I place my full chroma value there, and then starting with 9, move down to the 2. One of the things you realize, or so you start to see when you squint, looking at your own, if you've coated this background with a 5 gray, really doesn't matter what gray you coat it with, the principle I'm about to talk about, which we've already discussed, mixing paint, when we mix the value, the string, you're going to see it whatever value you put down. That idea of passage. Passage is when the value at the edge of your patch of color in this case is the same as the value that's next to it. So when you squint, they look like they bleed together. If you'll notice when you look at the screen, when you squint, this is very clear. You can see the colors here emerging. You can see them emerging here. But what happens when you squint right in this area? Well, yes, you can still see there's a brownish, right, that brownish color in there, but when you squint, you lose the edges of that patch into the 5 value gray that's behind it. So when you see passage, what that tells you is that although you might see hue and chroma differences, it tells you that the values are the same or similar. So as you go with each one of these strings, for me it's a 5, at the 5 position for each one of these hues, I should see this same passage occurring if I have my 5s mixed properly. So that is the string of yellow placed on my color wheel. The only thing I'll do, since I have the paint available, I'm going to put this aside. I might as well, since the paint is out, is get my pigment file, and it has that same hue circuit. Put the full chroma value, which is the 9 for yellow, put it on the hue circuit of the pigment file as well. So that's really all we'll be doing right now with the pigment file, is as we make the strings for the value scale color wheel, if you put the full chroma on the hue circuit on the value scale color wheel, before you wrap up that string and clean it off, you might as well put the full chroma value on your pigment file as well. So, a lot of information. Switch over here. A lot of information, I get it. This was actually a little bit longer than I was hoping it was going to be, but we got everything laid out at least for that first string of yellow. We went over the ideas of home value and full chroma, and passage, which is very important. Passage is really that idea, as I said, when you're mixing your value scale, you're looking, you can't see past the hue and the chroma, but you can look for that passage to help you match your values on your value scale. So that's it for right now. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and then the next video we'll get into more string mixing on the color wheel. Until next time.